Modern investment theory has been built on the idea of the pendulum. In his excellent book, Mastering the Market Cycle, Howard Marks explains how all investments swing along a pendulum of value. Assets move from undervalued to fairly valued to overvalued, and then swing back to where they began. When assets drop and are left for dead and nobody wants to buy them, they are at maximum undervalued and are at the peak of one side of the pendulum. Investors who recognize this will buy these assets on the cheap. As the market bottoms out and becomes less volatile and prices begin to rise, investors become more comfortable and the buying continues. As the price continues higher, the buying accelerates until prices hit euphoric levels. On the opposite end of the pendulum, at which point savvy investors begin to take profits and sell, and prices slide back toward fair value. In a normal world, the price will fluctuate over time along this pendulum of value. The business cycle refers to the expansion and contraction of credit and how that movement impacts asset prices. As credit is loosened, financial assets rise in value, and vice versa when tightened. Historically, the direction of credit is the current that moves the waves of the business cycle. These ebbs and flows typically play out over 10-year spans. Warren Buffett famously said, "Our markets work in 10-year cycles. It's a shame we only have 7-year memories." Buffett might be onto something. Over the past 50 years, 3 of the 5 decades have offered a Dow Jones boom. 2 have offered a Dow Jones bust. The 1980s witnessed a 238% increase in the markets. The 1990s garnered a whopping 309% return, and the current bull market that began in 2009 has seen stocks go higher by 280%. The other 2 decades offered a Dow Jones bust. In the 1970s, the Dow lost 1%. The 10 years from 2000 to 2010 is considered the lost decade because the Dow Jones returned negative and lost 8% of its value. Note that in the decades where the market underperforms, gold overperforms. Gold rose 16 times from 1971 to 1980, rising from $42 to $800. Gold rose nearly 8 times from 2000 to 2011, moving in price from $252 to nearly $2,000. In short, when stocks go bust, gold goes boom. Wall Street loves to promote the math that the stock market averages 7% per year and uses this to encourage staying invested all the time. What they fail to include in that revelation is that the 7% is a blended average. The boom decades average a positive 17% per year, and the bust decades average a negative 3%. When taken combined, the blended average is roughly 7%. For those ascribing to the wisdom of Warren Buffett, the odds are likely that the next decade will revert to the mean and become another lost decade. The boom and bust cycles of the last 50 years will likely continue. The next decade will return 0% for equities if the ebb and flow of the pendulum continues. Our premise, however, is that modern economic theory is broken, which means the business cycle is also broken. I believe this means less about a collapse in equities and more about a collapse in currencies. The coming great devaluation marks a turning and therefore a new direction. Only after a circle is completed can a new circle begin. Expecting the markets to return to the cyclicality of the business cycle assumes that after the flow of the last 10 years, which were fueled by manipulation of central banks forcing lower interest rates, it will be followed by an ebb in the coming decade where central banks push interest rates higher. The main premise of the Great Devaluation is that central banks are cornered and therefore will not willingly raise interest rates ever again. This will ultimately mean their end. The only way forward will be with a global monetary reset that begins a new cycle. The good news is that either way gold wins. If the business cycle continues, gold will soar. If the business cycle is dead, gold will serve as the keystone to the new system, just as it has been from the beginning. Cycles are round. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then begin anew. The weather cycle is a simple example. There are 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Then the cycle begins anew. These seasonal changes occur as the Earth's position to the Sun changes. A full turn around the Sun equals 1 year, just like an orbit around the Sun begins a new year. It's the completion of a full circle that begins a new cycle. In this same way, our lives are cyclical. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our lives are made up of 4 stages or seasons: adolescence, young adult, mature adult, and old age. Thousands of years ago, the Etruscans called this life cycle the saeculum, meaning a long life. It's made up of 4 generations, roughly 22 years apart. The saeculum, according to the Etruscans, was not an exact or fixed amount of time. Rather, it was a period that could be divided into 4 seasons of life that represent youth, rising adulthood, midlife, and old age. The Etruscans were a civilization of ancient Italy who reigned from 900 BC to 100 BC. According to legend, the gods had allotted a certain number of saecula to every population or civilization. The Etruscans themselves were allotted 10 saecula. To the Etruscans, the notion of the saeculum was as scientific a principle as the Earth revolving around the Sun is for people today. For the people of ancient Italy, it wasn't some abstract theory. The saeculum was the truth. In the 2nd century BC, Roman historians were using the saecula to chronicle and track wars. The powerful science of the saeculum was that every 90 years or so, mankind was destined to make the same mistakes and suffer through crisis. This was because there would be no first-hand witnesses remaining to remind them about their mistakes of the past. Therefore, roughly every 90 years there would be a crisis or an event so big that it would change the collective mindset of mankind. Rather than measure time in 100-year increments like we do today, the Etruscans measured time from big event to big event, from crisis to crisis in roughly 90-year increments. Their calendars marked events, not dates, that changed the collective mindset and began a new order. The word crisis comes from the Greek word krisis, which means to decide. These crises, moments, were identified by the decisions of the people in a new direction. In this way, the Etruscans prepared and took action to change in advance. Instead of reacting after the fact to the pain of crisis, they embraced change at the end of the supercycle rather than fight against it. Strauss and Howe, in their book The Fourth Turning, make the case that all of human history can be told through this supercycle of the saeculum. Certainly much of American history can be told through this 90-year cycle. The great wars of American history eerily follow this cyclical pattern. The Revolutionary War ended in 1776 and was then followed by the Civil War, which ended in 1864, almost 90 years later. The saeculum was specifically memorialized by Lincoln's famous speech at Gettysburg, which begins 77 years ago and refers to the signing of the Declaration of Independence 87 years earlier. The speech is considered one of the greatest orations ever given. World War II, which ended in 1945, followed the Civil War by 4 generations, a saeculum after Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. Each of these wars were major turning points in American history. Each of these wars was spawned by crises of inequality.